Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf and welcome to my wrap up for the month of May. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and in the month of May I did read some of those books I own, but I also was still reading quite a few books from the library due to the Women's Prize predominantly. So first of all, as always, we will have some stats, and then after that I will go through all of the books that I read from my least favourite to my most favourite of the month, roughly in that order. And finally, at the end of the video, we will visit the giant TBR numbers and see how those fared in the month of May. Before we get to that update, let's look at the numbers. So in May, I read a total of 17 books for a total of 4,755 pages. 4 of my books were audiobooks, 4 were library books, 3 of which were for the Women's Prize. 2 books were borrowed from my mum, so that adds to that library total really. So 6 borrowed books in total. I did DNF 1 book, which was an audiobook. I had 0 rereads this month. I read 2 books that I acquired in the month of May, and that left 5 books from the giant TBR. I'm carrying 2 books over into the month of May. One is Killer Come Back to Me by Ray Bradbury, which I have kind of put on pause a bit. Started reading this in the month of March. I didn't read any of the stories in April, and I haven't actually read any of the stories in May. That is still on the go. I'm also currently reading Black Butterflies. I possibly might finish that one today. This is my last book for the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist, and then I will have read all of them. Yay! So let's start with my DNF of the month. So I DNF'd an audiobook. It was The Chronicles of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery. So I didn't actually manage to read anything for Montgomery in the end because I DNF'd it. The reason for DNFing this, and I DNF'd it on the second story I think it was because it just wasn't what I was hoping for. When I was reading all of the Anne of Green Gables series, the parts that I didn't like of this series were the parts where the story sort of ceased to be about Anne and started to be about other people. And I also would have really liked more from Avonlea and from characters like Marilla, who I love, Davy and Dora, who I thought were great characters. And this book kicked off with characters that were nothing to do with any of those characters. The first was a story that was actually referred to in one of the Anne of Green Gables books about how Anne basically got a man who hadn't proposed yet to get married. I wasn't hugely interested in that, and the second story just seemed to be about someone who I'd never heard of before. I wasn't particularly interested in. I would have liked some stories about Avonlea life and about Marilla and the characters I was fond of, and that didn't happen. If you think I was wrong to DNF this and you think it will improve and that there are stories about those characters, do let me know in the comments. But I have DNF'd this one for now. It's also unfortunately not a great audiobook. It had a very monotonous narrative voice and that didn't help. Next up, we're going into the okay books of the month, and unfortunately I'm starting the list again with Aurora Teagarden. So I read Dead Over Heels by Charlaine Harris. I've been reading one Aurora Teagarden book per month for the Into the Library read-along, which is hosted by Angie's Book Chatter, and Amy at BookTube with Amy. These are definitely getting better, they are improving. This was the first one that I was reading for the first time. The other ones were rereads. And I didn't actually dip into this omnibus to read it. I ended up listening to it on an audiobook from Libby. I'm not sure if that was a good call or not, because I found Aurora to be even less likeable in audio form. Like, I think when I'm reading this on the page, I can imagine her to be a bit nicer than she comes across, but the interpretation of how she spoke and everything just made her come across really quite awful. I didn't like her very much based on the audio representation of her. I don't think this one has got the best story of the bunch so far. It was a bit convoluted for me, a bit far-fetched. There were elements that I liked of it. At some point I'm sure I'm going to either start to really like this series or DNF this series. So next up in my okay category was Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This was one of the books I had remaining for the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist, and in fact it made it to the shortlist as well. This is the story of Kohda, and it's set against the backdrop of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and it is predominantly a story about an affair that Kohda has. There are definitely good elements to this book, but I unfortunately didn't particularly care for Kohda as a character, and as a result I found the book quite boring. I found it a bit of a slog to get through, in all honesty, so that was a real shame because I feel like this book had a lot of potential. I also feel like a lot of people have really liked this book, so it was a shame that I didn't particularly. But yeah, I didn't dislike it, I just thought it was an okay book. It got another book ticked off for the Women's Prize, and yeah, I still probably would try more books from this author if and when she writes another novel. Next up we had a buddy read, which was The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster, and I read this with the lovely Gemma from Gemma Books, and we are having some mixed buddy reads at the moment, and this one was one we didn't particularly love. This is definitely a book that I think I would have got a lot more out of if I had actually read this in childhood. This is a children's book, and it got off to such a promising start. I really loved all of the parts about this that were about words and wordplay and things like that, but I didn't feel it did a particularly coherent job of the quest element of the story. We follow a young boy, Milo, who finds a mysterious Tollbooth in his bedroom one day, and it's kind of a story of transformation of Milo going from like a bit bored of his life to recognising that he has a great life. It did get a little bit too nonsense and silly for me in places. There's a part where they end up on an island because they've jumped to conclusions and things like that. Like some of the sort of side tangents drove me a bit mad really, but I think that this would have worked really well if I'd read this when I was a child. But adult me just didn't appreciate all of the elements of this book, although I did, as I've said, really appreciate like the wordplay stuff, which was really quite fun. Mixed feelings on this one. It was okay, it was fine. Next up, we're going into the good category. These books were strong books, but I didn't quite think that they made it into my very good category. So first up, this was one that I found a little bit strange and a little bit disappointing. I think I was too hyped up for this book. So this was Woman Eating by Claire Kohda, and this is a story about a vampire in modern days called Lyd, and Lyd, or Lydia, tells this in first person perspective, which I liked, but I just thought it was going to be a more interesting story about a vampire. It's much more actually about sort of day-to-day life and existence, and more about being human than it is about being vampire, I think. There's a lot of, as you can tell by the title, a lot of thoughts about food, a lot of mentions of food, a lot of mentions of art as well. Lyd is sort of an artist and has like an apprenticeship, I think it is, at some sort of art place. This is primarily a story about her hunger and her quest to stay with her humanity, but there was something I really wanted to happen in this book, and I was convinced that if it didn't happen, this would be like a book that I just really didn't like. But luckily it did happen. This book had a really strong ending, I think. I enjoyed the ending a lot more than I enjoyed the rest of the book. Just didn't quite make my very good books for this month, but I still had a good time reading it, and I would recommend it if you would like to read like a different spin on vampires and a different spin on sort of, it's a bit of a depressed woman book really, but if you like that sort of thing you might like this. And last up in my good category, probably should put this in the very good category, but the thing holding me back from putting it in very good is because I did feel like this book was a bit of a slog at times, and there are really good parts of it, really, really well written parts. Parts that I thought were absolutely excellent, but there's equally parts where I thought we could have done without it. Maybe this is definitely on the cusp of very good. Again, it's about the disappointment factor. So I was disappointed in this because I felt like a lot of people said it was an absolute favourite book, and I just felt like it wasn't for me. Maybe I've read it at the wrong time. Maybe it took me too long because I started reading this just before I was ill last month, and it meant that it took a much longer time than I was anticipating, and I had some bigger gaps in reading than I was anticipating. But yeah, it was this one. It was Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I did find long swathes of this book a real struggle and a real slog, and when I read the introduction of this afterwards so that I didn't get any spoilers, it did say that Dostoevsky wrote a version of this book that was just about like the crime and the person dealing with the aftermath of having committed a crime, and he burnt that manuscript, which I'm quite sad about, because I think that that would have been a better book. As it is, there is that element to the book which I think is the strongest, and there's also lots and lots of side tangents and just characters that I didn't really feel any connection with or want to know that much about, and it sort of, for me, convolutes down that main story and made me find this quite difficult to get through. Probably me, because this is a classic for a reason. I could see by the end how this kind of connects to crime fiction, which I think was the reason I got it in the first place, as a book that has influenced a lot of crime fiction. And for me, the crime in this was the strongest element of it. And I actually also thought the epilogue was very, very strong. And I thought that being in the character's head a bit following the crime was really interesting, and the way he responds to the crime, very interesting. But a lot of the other things in the book I could have done without, unfortunately. That is not to say this is not a good book, because I really think it is, but I don't think I would tackle it again. So yeah, it was a shame that I struggled with this, because I'd been wanting to read it for so many years, and I'm glad I have read it. I really liked Raskolnikov's story. I thought that was the strongest element of this for me. As my first big Dostoevsky, I don't think I'll be rushing out to pick up more Dostoevsky, but if you have one that you would like to recommend that you think I would enjoy more than this, then do let me know. Definitely a really good book, but it just took me such a long time, and I felt like parts of it really dragged. So yeah. Other parts were brilliant, particularly the crime. Next, we're going into the very good books, and I mean, again, this next one is kind of on the cusp of that, and that was Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. This was one of the other books I read for the Women's Prize, and this one didn't make it to the shortlist, but it was a good book. I enjoyed reading it. The characters in this one were really interesting, and we followed 3 generations of the North family, but there were just certain elements of this that didn't sit particularly comfortably with me. One was that, and this is very early on in the story, so not a spoiler, but I couldn't comprehend that you would bring a child back to the place where they were abused, and not only that, but force them to live with the abuser. That was very odd to me. I understand that we're supposed to believe that this mother didn't have anywhere else to turn, but I really did struggle with that. The perspectives I actually enjoyed most were Hazel's. Hazel had the husband Myron who built her the house, and that was like the sort of grandmother in this. She's not around anymore in the actual present day storyline. We also follow Miriam and August, who are her 2 children, and we follow Joan, who is Miriam's oldest daughter, and Joan's perspective, I believe, was the first person perspective when we had her chapters. I didn't particularly care for Miriam, who was the mother of Joan. I thought that she was probably my least favourite character and perspective. I really liked August. She had a really excellent, really vividly presented salon in their house, and that really worked for me. That was so vibrant and well told, that aspect of the story. And the daughter Joan, who has like a talent for art, I really enjoyed her storyline as well. I really liked the way this looked at both place and family in different times and throughout the years. And yeah, I found it a very interesting book. I thought it was well written. Next up, I don't know what I've done with this book. I meant to go and get it, but I did show it in my haul video. That was Carrying the Elephant by Michael Rosen, which was a book of poetry. So I read this on the back of reading Michael Rosen's other book this month, Getting Better, and I'll talk about that later. Michael Rosen sort of writes poetry that is almost stories. These tell various different stories, some of which were also touched on in Getting Better, and there was definitely a really strong link between these two books. I may yet still do a video reviewing these two books together. The reason I bought this book was for the poems about Michael Rosen's son Eddie and his grief around the loss of Eddie at the age of 18 to meningitis. And I thought that these were so strong, such brilliant poems. They dealt with grief so vividly and so well, and I could see how Michael Rosen referred to this book in Getting Better as being something that really helped him, and he wrote down his feelings about this. I actually thought that the whole book was going to really centre around that, but this is mainly a sequence of poems that makes up like the middle section of the poetry book. Very sad. I think Michael Rosen is fantastic, a great poet. I really did get a lot out of reading this book, even if it made me feel very sad. Next, I have an audiobook, which was Varjak Paw by S.F. Said. I finished this right at the beginning of the month, so it's hard to remember, but it's a fun children's book about a cat called Varjak Paw, who goes outside for the very first time over the wall in order to find a help for his family who have had someone new move in with them. I really enjoyed this book's take on cats, and I thought it nailed the cat personality to a T. The things that the cat characters understand and don't understand is so typically cattish. You can tell the author knows cats, and yeah, I just really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed the cast of characters in this, the other cats that Varjak meets along the way, and his family and so on. And I really liked the plot of this book as well, so highly recommend this as an audiobook because it has some great cats. If you like cats, I think you'll like Varjak Paw. So next up, very much a miserymay book, was S by Slavenka Drakulić. I was sent this by Gemma from Gemma Books, and she told me it was one of the most devastating and horrifying books she'd ever read, and I can confirm that yes, it is an extremely miserable, extremely sad book about the Balkans. This is set in 1992 during the Bosnian War. This is the story of a Bosnian woman. We begin with her giving birth to a child, and we then go back and see what has led up to that. And it deals with camps that there were in Bosnia, and the author says at the end how she interviewed women who this actually happened to, and she's hoped to give them a voice through this book. I just thought that this was really well done. It's a book with a lot of horrific things happening in it. I would not say that this was a book that you should read if you don't want to read about like the horrors of war and the worst things happening to women. There's a lot of rape in this book, and it's very dark and horrific. S, at the beginning, it has been a school teacher, and she comments several times that when she is taken from her home, she almost feels like she goes blank and out of herself and doesn't like feel anything for ages. And I felt like we were sort of made to feel that in this book. Like at times I was horrified, but at other times I felt a bit held at arm's length by S. I did feel a bit distanced from her. I think that this is one of those books that I found very interesting and informative and well done, but I didn't enjoy reading it because I couldn't enjoy reading a book with this content. But that's not to say I didn't think it was really, really good. I did. It was very powerful. There were a couple of bits that just really do hit you in terms of sadness. So yeah, this is a really hard book to read, but I would say a really important one in the topic that it deals with. And next up, not as hard hitting at all, and I did feel a bit bad putting this above S in the rankings, but I wouldn't actually say it was above S. I would say that like S, this, and probably the next book were all like, I enjoyed them a similar amount, but they were very different books to each other. So this one is Homesick by Jennifer Croft. This is the last book that I was reading from the long list that didn't make the shortlist of the Women's Prize. Homesick by Jennifer Croft is like the book on the list that had people most mystified in terms of, is it actually fiction? Why is it on the Women's Prize list? It's apparently started out life as a book in Spanish. It also apparently started out life as a memoir and was then rewritten again in English as a memoir, and then rewritten again as, like, I suppose this must be autofiction, because it is, it very much does read like a memoir, and I wouldn't have been surprised if you'd have told me this was a memoir, but it's kind of branded as a story. So it follows Amy and her little sister Zoe, and Zoe becomes very unwell, and therefore the girls are educated at home. It's kind of a coming of age story for Amy. It's told in vignettes, some much shorter than others. Some of the things that I thought it covered really, really well that I kind of related to were Amy's like feelings about her sister being taken into hospital, and Amy trying to like cheer up her sister in hospital and things like that. And as someone who has experienced being in hospital from like the patient side rather than the sister side, I thought that that element of it was done really, really well. It was interesting to me to read from the perspective of like a sibling looking in on that and not being able to go with her sister to certain things. That was really poignant for me, and I thought was well written. Also was very interested in Amy's interest in language and her desire to become a translator. There is like a big storyline in this about learning to speak other languages. I thought that this book was really interesting. There is like a central tragedy that happens in it that kind of sets Amy off on her path, I suppose, that is part of her growing up, but also that really does traumatise her. I suppose my overriding opinion on Homesick is that it would have made a really, really good memoir. I liked the vignettes. I liked how short this was, but how it still told like the full story that you needed to know. A good coming of age story. And it was those couple of things that I related to and or was interested in that pushed it that little bit higher for me. So I thought this was a good read. Next up we have Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, the flagship book of miserymay. And I read this with a whole group of people got together for miserymay. So thank you to Gemma at Gemma Books and Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot for setting up that group, because I got a lot out of reading this book with other people. I think hearing other people's opinions on this book was one of the best parts for me. My main problem with Jude that meant it's not like up there in my favourites of the month was that I didn't have the element of surprise for this book, and I think the element of surprise on one main event in this book is absolutely key, which is why I appreciated reading it with a group where most people didn't know that spoiler. I knew that spoiler because I had watched a film version of this starring Kate Winslet as Sue and Christopher Eccleston as Jude, and so I could really, really remember this key scene. I actually think, looking back on it, that having watched that, I think I maybe read that scene to see how similar it was. So I really did remember it, unfortunately. Didn't know anything about the rest of the book, and I did think this is a really good book. It's not my favourite Hardy. I actually did enjoy The Mayor of Casterbridge more, but I find Hardy very readable. Very interesting topics that he deals with. Didn't think that Jude was a protagonist who I particularly cared that deeply for until possibly right at the very end. I did feel it was very sad. With other characters, I had times that I liked them and times that I disliked them, sometimes both at the same time. And yes, it was an interesting book for all of those reasons. But yeah, definitely a very miserable book. And I'm glad to know that this is the most miserable of Hardy's books, because it means that I can read the rest without thinking I'm going to be sent into a misery spiral, because this one is very miserable. A really good read, and I'm so glad I read it with all those other people as well. We're getting near the top of the very good category, and this was a really good surprise, this book, and it's The Expendable Man by Dorothy B. Hughes. I read this one for the Killer Reads Thriller Month Book Club, which is hosted by AJ Dunn at AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, and this one is one of those ones that is not your typical thriller, I would say, but I would recommend people to read this because it's a really interesting sort of character study, and it really has so much tension, so much suspense, so skillfully done. I would say it's a book where not an awful lot actually happens, but considering that, there is so much tension, and the way that Dorothy B. Hughes works that tension up was just absolutely fantastic. This was a joy to read. It's definitely a book to be savoured slowly, and I did savour this slowly. Really enjoyed reading this at a slow pace, drinking in all of the different imagery of like the American countryside. Let me read you the opening, the first few sentences of chapter 1, because I just thought the descriptive writing was beautiful. Across the tracks there was a different world. The long and lonely country was the colour of sand. The horizon hills were haze black. The clumps of mesquite stood in dark pools of their own shadowing. But the pools and the rim of dark horizon were discerned only by conscious seeing, else the world was all sand, brown and tan and copper and pale beige. Even the sky at this moment was sand, reflection of the fading bronze of the sun. It was good to be out on the road, away from the banging of the town on the either side of the tracks. And that is the kind of level of description of most of the book, so it's a really skillful book. Yeah, it didn't have a lot of mystery to it for me, but I wasn't too worried about that because it was offering something very different as a thriller. So this is probably one of my favourites that we've read with the Killer Reads Thriller Month Book Club so far, particularly in terms of the quieter, not full-on thriller type ones. This was a really good read. Next up, we have one of the cheerful books that I read in Misery May, and that is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. I thought this was pretty hilarious. So one of the things I wasn't expecting about Three Men in a Boat is that it actually does tell you quite a lot of factual information about different towns along the Thames as they go along the river. I did enjoy that, but I didn't enjoy all of that part as much as the funny anecdotes that were in this. I found this really funny. The characters in it are great, especially the dog. One of my highlights was definitely when they're packing to go on the trip. I found that pretty hilarious. Even funnier than that was an anecdote about the maze at Hampton Court. Brilliant. And when they sat down and had some Irish stew, that was also pretty epically hilarious. I loved the way this was told by Jerome K. Jerome, and I thought it was a really enjoyable Victorian book. I was reading this with the lovely Flick Reads over on Instagram, and during our discussion she said that the characters put her a little bit in mind of Wooster out of Jeeves and Wooster, only like not so upper class, and I definitely agreed with that. It had that humour, it had the sort of buffoonery and silliness of that. And because of that, I did read another book later on that I'm going to tell you about. But yeah, I had a really fun time with this. It definitely eased the misery of miserymay, and it was a great read. Highly recommend. Next is the book that I received from my subscription, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. And I've actually recorded a solo review of this one, so I won't go into it too much, but this is kind of a homage to the golden age of crime type of book. There's quite a lot of reference to Agatha Christie in this, which I appreciated, and in and of itself it's a pretty good closed circle, sort of isolated location type mystery, but told from the point of view of a writer who is writing down his experiences, and he's previously been a writer of books about how to write crime fiction. So yeah, a really enjoyable read, and do check out my review of this if you would like to hear more. The last book before we get to my absolute favourites of the month is The Code of the Woosters by P.G. Wodehouse. I listened to this on audio, and it's always a joy to listen to the Jeeves and Wooster books on audio, because I have a P.G. Wodehouse collection narrated by Stephen Fry, and I would highly recommend this. Stephen Fry does a great job of the voices, and I really did enjoy The Code of the Woosters. I think it was probably my favourite of the Jeeves and Wooster books so far. This one is like a whole narrative, not short stories like some of them have been, and it does refer back to some of Bertie's previous adventures and scrapes that Jeeves has got him out of. But this one had its own quite hilarious plot revolving around a cow creamer and a trip to stay at Totley Towers. Yeah, what different people ask Bertie Wooster to do and how he gets into a scrape and gets out of it. It was absolutely hilarious. I really enjoyed listening to it. It's narrowly missing out on a place in my favourites of the month. I have two favourites for the month of May, two 5-star reads. So first of all, Becky Chambers' The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This is the first in Becky Chambers' Wayfarers series. I read this with the lovely Ange from Ange's Book Chatter, and it was an impromptu buddy read for this month, and I ended up really loving it. I felt this book again really lent itself to taking your time and just enjoying it over a longer period, so I did just that. Really liked all the characters in this and all of their different storylines and relationships. It follows Rosemary Harper on the ship The Wayfarer, and they are like a tunnelling ship that makes tunnels through space, and they have a big job, and this follows them on their way to that big job. I wouldn't say this actually follows Rosemary Harper that much, although she's kind of introduced as a main character, and we do find out elements of her backstory along the way. It's also very much an ensemble cast, and we do get backstories and get to really know all of the rest of the crew, who I really liked. I thought the characters were amazing. I thought the universe that Becky Chambers has sort of invented here just really worked for me. I loved the way she described like what had happened to Earth, but had like Earth as part of it as well. It was really well thought out without ever giving you too much world building at once. I liked the sort of trope of seeing all of this new world through like a new person's eyes, as we followed Rosemary initially. It's super interesting and had a couple of really exciting and suspenseful moments in it. I just really enjoyed reading this from start to finish. Thought it was a great book. I would definitely be reading the rest of Becky Chambers' books, because I thought she had created a brilliant universe. Great read, and I would highly recommend it if you like sci-fi. Even if you don't like sci-fi, because I don't read very much sci-fi, considering this is set in space, I would say that this is a great way into reading some more sci-fi. Fantastic book. Really enjoyed it. My final book for May, my absolute top favourite of the month, I've already mentioned it once, is Getting Better by Michael Rosen. This was a very sad book in that it dealt very much with grief, very much with post-traumatic stress from having COVID and being in a coma for like 40 days. I just thought Michael Rosen is incredible. His writing was incredible. His narration of his own book was incredible. I just thought this was so well written, because Michael Rosen talks about all of these different things that he's been through, or that his family has been through in the past, and little things that he's done have helped him, and he then sort of extends that to, maybe you could try this. And all the time he says, this is what's worked for me. I'm not saying to people, go out and do this and you will feel better, but here are some things that could help you feel better as well if you find yourself in similar situations, or you are grieving, or you are trying to come to terms with the fact that your body maybe doesn't work quite as well as it used to, and that sort of thing. The mental side of things as well as the physical side of things. I loved the way this referenced back to things that Michael had done through the past. There were things that I picked out that he actually mentions in some of his children's poetry that I read way back. I would highly recommend the audio read by Michael Rosen himself. He really gets this across in exactly the way I would expect him to. It was an absolutely fantastic listen. I wouldn't say this would be for everybody. Perhaps if you are grieving, it would be a bit raw for you. I was very deeply saddened by the chapters about his son Eddie. So not only was it really desperately sad, it was also very honest and brutal, and told like the full story about Michael finding his son when he had died. It was very emotional. Another thing that was super relevant to me in this book was the way Michael Rosen talked about feelings after a long stay in hospital. No words have ever really resonated with me that much as this did. I could really relate, and some of Michael Rosen's thoughts about recovery after that just resonated with me so much, and I found that incredibly emotional. I would say that aspects of this book can be quite overwhelming, but I would also say that it's done in such a hopeful and helpful way that I really appreciated this book. And I read that book partly for Mental Health May and partly for the Spoonies Readathon, and both of those will be linked in the description down below because I enjoyed participating in both of them. That is all of the books I read in the month of May, and I've been talking for a very long time already, so let's get to the giant TBR. So I had 170 books on the giant TBR at the end of April. I then hauled my crime subscription book, but I have already read that, so it's not adding to the giant TBR. I showed in a previous haul 4 books that I had hauled, and I've already read one of those, so I'm adding 3 to the giant TBR, which takes us to 173 books. I also then, at the end of the month, had a bit of an accidental book haul that my husband said I could have these as a treat, as it was double points at Waterstones. So yeah, so I hauled 3 more books. Now, one of these I have already read, Wool, but I bought it because I want to own that series and watch the new Silo series on television. And the 3rd book in the series I haven't yet read, which is Dust, and I also bought the next book in the Death series by Terry Pratchett that I really want to read as well. So that's Reaper Man. So these 2 are adding to the giant TBR, which takes us to 175 books. But I unhauled some books in a Try a Chapter video, plus I decided to unhaul a couple of the others. So let me show you the unhaul pile. I did also want to mention this book. I found this on my shelves, and it is listed on my giant TBR, but it sort of falls into the category of a non-fiction that I would never read from cover to cover. This is only like a book I would dip into, and other books that are on my shelf that are like dipping into books that I will never read from cover to cover, I don't actually put them on my giant TBR because I don't have the intention of reading them from cover to cover. So this is going into like my non-fiction section, coming off the giant TBR. So that takes us down to 174. I also have my books from the Try a Chapter and 2 other books. I'm unhauling all of these because I don't want to read them anymore, and that is 7 books, leaving the giant TBR, which takes us down to 167 books. I then read 5 books from the giant TBR, which were Jude the Obscure, A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, S, Crime and Punishment, and The Expendable Man. So that brings us down to 162 books. Yay! I'm really pleased with 162 books as a new total. I'm glad I've had a bit of an unhaul because June is my birthday month and I will never be able to resist getting books for my birthday. So I don't know what's going to happen to the giant TBR in June, but in May it did go down. And that is all for today. So if you have enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. What were your favourite books of the month in May? And have you read any of these books? If you have, do let me know in the comments. And I will hope very much to see you all again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.